somewhere in the middle of the North Sea and the Thames Estuary, rising out of cold grey water with no land in sight. There are structures that look like they were designed by someone who had never seen a building, but had been given a very detailed description of one. They stand on legs. They have platforms. Some of them are connected by walkways, clustered together like a small community of robots frozen mid-stride. From a distance, in the right light, with fog rolling off the water, they look genuinely alien, like something that crawled up from the seabed and decided to stay. They are called the Maunsell Sea Forts, and they were built by Britain during the Second World War to shoot down German aircraft and intercept V-1 flying bombs before they could reach London. They worked, and then they were abandoned. And then, decades later, people started doing extraordinarily strange things with them. To understand why Britain built gun platforms in the middle of the ocean, you need to understand the particular problem Britain faced in 1940 and 1941. The Luftwaffe was bombing British cities, and a significant portion of those bombers were approaching from the sea, flying low to avoid radar, coming in over the Thames Estuary and the North Sea shipping lanes. There was no convenient place to put anti-aircraft guns. You could line the coast, but the bombers were already past the coast before ground defences could engage them properly. What Britain needed was something further out, something in the water. Guy Maunsell was a civil engineer who had already been working on naval forts, large concrete structures designed to be towed out to sea and sunk into position in shallow coastal waters. These became the army forts, and they were enormous things. A single, hollow, concrete pontoon base, 2 concrete legs rising from it, and a platform on top housing guns, living quarters, a radar installation, and enough men to operate all of it. They looked like brutalist lighthouses designed by someone with a specific interest in science fiction. The first of them, Rough Sands Fort, was put in position in 1942. More followed, Sunkhead, Tongue Sands, and Knock John. They sat in the Thames Estuary, a line of mechanical sentinels watching the approaches to London. Then came the Navy forts, which were a different design entirely and considerably stranger. Rather than a single monolithic structure, the Navy forts consisted of a cluster of individual platforms, each one mounted on 2 hollow steel legs connected to each other by walkways and cables, arranged around a central radar tower. Each platform had a specific purpose: gun platform, searchlight platform, Bofors platform, control room. Together, they formed a kind of small industrial village, suspended above the water on stilts, interconnected and interdependent. There were 3 of them: Ruff's Tower, Sealand, which would later become something remarkable, and the various Shivering Sands and Red Sands clusters. They were positioned further out to sea than the army forts, in international waters or close to it, which would later prove to be legally very significant indeed. Life on these forts was precisely as grim as you would expect. The North Sea does not care about human comfort. In winter, winds came across the water with nothing to stop them and everything to prove. The platforms swayed. The walkways between platforms became genuinely dangerous in heavy weather, and men crossing between stations would clip themselves to guide ropes rather than trust their own balance. The noise was constant: sea noise, wind noise, gun noise during action, and underneath all of it, the low metallic groan of steel structures flexing against the force of the water below. Crews rotated on and off by boat, with the handover itself being a dangerous exercise when the sea was running high. And yet, there were men who preferred it to the alternatives. Being stationed on a sea fort meant you were unlikely to be bombed, at least not by accident. The Luftwaffe knew exactly where the forts were, but hitting a structure the size of a small house from altitude required either precision or luck that German bombers frequently lacked. The isolation that made the postings uncomfortable also made them, in a strange way, safe. The war was happening over there, on the mainland, in the cities. Out here there was just the sea and the guns and the tea. The guns were the point of the exercise, and they were effective. The Maunsell Forts are credited with shooting down 22 aircraft and 30 V-1 flying bombs during the course of the war, which sounds modest until you consider that each of those aircraft and each of those bombs would otherwise have continued toward London, with no one to stop them. The forts also served as early warning stations, their radar picking up incoming raids and passing information to Fighter Command before the aircraft crossed the coast. In that role, their contribution is harder to quantify, but probably more significant than the direct kills. When the war ended, the forts were decommissioned and the men were brought home. The structures themselves stayed where they were, because moving them was expensive and complicated, and there was a great deal of rebuilding to do on the mainland. They sat in the water through the late 1940s and into the 1950s, rusting gently, inhabited only by seabirds and the particular atmosphere of abandonment that settles on structures built for a purpose that no longer exists. Then the 1960s happened, and the forts became something else entirely. The story of pirate radio and the Maunsell Forts is one of those chapters of British history that seems too strange to have actually occurred, and yet it is thoroughly documented. In 1964, a former army officer named Paddy Roy Bates began broadcasting from one of the decommissioned forts under the name Radio Essex. He was not the first to try something like this. Offshore radio stations, broadcasting pop music to a British population starved of it by the BBC's monopoly, had already begun appearing on ships anchored outside territorial waters. But Bates had noticed something that others had not quite fully exploited. The Navy forts sat in waters that were arguably outside British jurisdiction. They were far enough from the coast that the Territorial Waters Jurisdiction Act, which Britain had used to shut down some of the ship-based stations, did not clearly apply. In 1967, Bates went further. He took possession of Ruff's Tower, which sits approximately 12 kilometres off the coast of Suffolk, in water that is technically outside the 3 nautical mile territorial limit that Britain claimed at the time. He declared it an independent sovereign nation. He named it the Principality of Sealand. He made himself Prince Roy I. His wife became Princess Joan. The platform that had been built to house anti-aircraft guns and radar equipment and cold wet sailors became the territorial basis for a micronation that has, against all reasonable expectation, persisted into the 21st century. Britain attempted to assert authority over Sealand and failed, partly because the legal position was genuinely murky, and partly because Roy Bates was not the sort of man who responded to official letters by quietly complying. There was a legal case. A British court ruled it had no jurisdiction over events occurring on the platform. Germany, whose nationals had become involved in a coup attempt on Sealand in 1978, an event that involved helicopters, hostages, and a level of geopolitical absurdity that defies easy summary, sent a diplomat to negotiate with Bates for the release of the German participants, which constituted a form of de facto diplomatic recognition that Sealand has cited ever since. The other forts had their own afterlives. Red Sands and Shivering Sands became radio stations briefly, then fell silent again. Tongue Sands Fort collapsed into the sea in the 1990s, weakened by decades of neglect and the constant attritional force of the water around it. The army forts in the estuary were largely demolished. What remains today is a handful of the Navy fort clusters, still standing, still visible from the Essex and Kent coasts on clear days, and still drawing a particular kind of pilgrim. Historians, urban explorers, people who have read about them and want to stand close to something that looks like it should not be there. There have been various proposals over the years to turn the remaining forts into hotels or museums or luxury retreats for people with a tolerance for North Sea weather, and a taste for the genuinely unusual. None of these proposals have yet succeeded, largely because the engineering challenges of making a 60-year-old rusting steel platform comfortable and legally accessible are considerable, and largely because the forts exist in a regulatory grey area that makes planning permission a creative exercise. What they are, in the end, is a monument to a particular kind of British problem-solving. The problem was, German aircraft are coming from that direction, and there is only water between them and London. The solution was, build something in the water and put guns on it. The design that resulted, functional, improvised-looking, utterly indifferent to elegance, turned out to be robust enough to outlast the war by 8 decades and counting. They were built to last perhaps a decade. They have lasted more than 7. Stand on the deck of a boat in the Thames Estuary on a grey morning and look toward the horizon. And if you are in the right place, you will see the silhouette of Red Sands Fort against the sky. 7 platforms on stilts, connected by catwalks, some of them leaning slightly now as the years have worked on them. They look still like something from a different world, like machines that arrived from somewhere else and decided that this particular stretch of cold water was as good a place as any to stop. The Germans never took them. The sea has not quite taken them yet. They are still out there, waiting, in the way that only things built for war and then left to the elements can wait, with patience and with a kind of ruined dignity that nothing built for comfort ever quite achieves.